Hello and welcome to another Dungeons & Dragons session dramatization set in the world of Alter Aeon. Our protagonists are Kara the War Mage, Morden the Hexblade, Tess the Sorceress, and Sienna the Rogue. I am Shadowfax, the Dungeon Master. Session 13. Break the Chain. For this session, some world building is laid out. One thing I had to do was work Chain Devils into a game setting that already has a robust selection of demonic creatures. What was decided was that Chitons were demons manufactured for the Great Wars to serve as shock troops in demonic armies. Later, Chitons developed their own highly structured society. We also worked out a credible origin story for dragons in the world of Alter Aeon, deciding that modern dragon races evolved as the offspring of Tempest, the dragon god, and that he likely created other reptilian races such as kobolds to serve them. Or at the very least, kobolds may believe that Tempest created them. Our heroes had spent the night at the Vamarkan Mercenary Guild Hall. As soon as Sienna woke up early in the morning, he made a beeline to the blacksmith. He remembered the way from the night before, heading south to the town square and then turning to the right until almost to the western gate of the town. One of Rodnar's apprentices was working the bellows of the forge, getting it nice and hot and ready for a day's work. Sienna inquired about the status of his armor, and the boy admitted that he didn't know anything about it. He asked Sienna to wait while he fetched his father, and he soon returned with a tired dwarf in tow. The blacksmith wiped the sleep from his eyes while he explained to Sienna that he had cut and resized the mithril shirt last night, and he would be spending most of the day engaged in enchanting it. He asked if he was coming to the town council meeting with Morden, and when Sienna answered in the affirmative, Rodnar promised to bring it to the meeting. Satisfied, Sienna returned to the guild hall to find his new friends up and about, having helped themselves to the food in the guild's larder. Over breakfast, Kara, Morden, and Tess took some time to explain what had happened in Venezian with the Chain Devil to Sienna. Morden and Tess admitted that they felt somewhat responsible for having released it into the world, but Kara placed the blame squarely on Sined. Before heading out, Char stepped in to give Morden a copy of the contract she had worked out with Charlista, and Morden approved it. Since they had some free time before the meeting in the evening, Kara said that she was going to do some research about Chitons, having remembered that there was a large number of books in the Mages Guild. Tess wanted to practice her magic, so she put on her show clothes and headed down to the Sheep and Shovel with Sienna following. Morden said that he'd catch up with them later. Tess walked into the tavern and stood at the end of one of the large banquet tables, barking her name and intention to put on a performance. The 5 other patrons in the establishment turned their attention to Tess, and the bartender slipped out from behind the bar and slid up next to her before she began her show. He whispered in her ear, first thanking her again for saving his little girl, and then telling her that he got 10% of anything she earned. She agreed, and then put on a magic show using Silent Image as her primary attraction. Sienna played a lively tune on his flute to accompany the display, which included colorful explosions and geometric designs drawn in the air all around her. Fernando was part of the act, appearing to burst out of some of the fireworks. Morden had gone to the apothecary only to find out that the shop wasn't open yet, so he entered the tavern to see the latter part of Tess's performance. When she was done, the patrons applauded her, and each gave her 1 gold piece. She gave one to the bartender, and when he went to make change, she told him it was fine and that he'd keep it. She looked around for Holly and found her washing dishes in the kitchen. Holly was disappointed that she had missed the show, and Tess gave her a gold piece and told her to buy some candy. She slipped it into her apron. When Tess returned to the dining area, Edna the apothecarist, who had seen her performance, came up to Tess and asked her if she had been part of a troupe of elven performers that had come through a few weeks prior. Tess said that she wasn't, and asked Edna to describe them to her, to which Edna replied that they wore twigs and flowers in their hair, and that the color of their hair was blonde and green. Tess confirmed that they were green elves, and although her father was a green elf, she still did not personally know the performers. Edna thanked her for the show and encouraged her to come by the apothecary later. Kara had gone to the Mages Guild, which was on the second story of the town council's meeting hall. There hadn't been anyone there the last time she visited, but this time there was a mousy middle-aged man wearing a gray robe, sitting on a bench and reading a book. He immediately took a notice of her arrival and started plying her with questions about her spellcasting ability. Upon hearing that she was a war mage, he started to encourage her to join his guild. He said he was the guildmaster and the only member, and that he was lonely. So many spellcasters, he said, passed through the town, but none of them were interested in pure arcane study. And after letting him ramble a bit longer, Kara cut him off, stating that she already belonged to a guild and just needed a book about chain devils. The mage sighed and retrieved a book from one of the shelves entitled Kisko the Necromancer's Guide to Extraplanar Entities. She wanted to take the book with her, and although the mage protested that only guild members could take the books, Kara sweet-talked the mage until he relented, with the promise that she would return the book. Kara then went down to the Sheep and Shovel to find her companions already there. Tess was showing off some magic tricks to Morden, using prestidigitation to make plumes of colored smoke appear in two-dimensional shapes. Although not as accomplished in magic, Morden scooped up some of the smoke and arranged it around Fernando to make it look like smoke was coming out of his ears. Sienna also sat nearby practicing on his flute, occasionally taking out a knife to carve small adjustments in it. The Hexblade then stuck his arm inside his dark companion to make it look like he was puppeting it. Kara laughed and got into the act, casting Ring of Blades and then juggling the blades until the spell expired. The War Mage then sat down nearby to read her book. While she read, Sienna enjoyed a game of darts. The four stayed there until after lunch, and then returned to the Mercenary Guild Hall. Kara shared what she had learned about chitons from the guide, most notably about how they were vulnerable to silver or good-aligned weapons. The only qualifying weapons that they had at the moment were the 2 silver darts that Sinet had picked up in Venetia and given to Morden. Morden passed them on to Sienna, reasoning that he had seen Sienna playing darts and could tell that they'd be more useful in the rogue's possession. The group agreed that magical good weapons would be hard to come by, but they supposed that Rodnar might have a small selection of silvered weapons. Kara also said that chain devils were known to be immune to cold and had resistances to all kinds of spells. Tess wondered aloud how they could possibly defeat such a foe, but Morden reassured her that was possible. Morden went across town to investigate about the silver weapons, but Rodnar was busy enchanting Sienna's armor, so arrangements were made with his apprentices to bring all of the silvered weapons in the shop to the council meeting that evening. Kara visited the apothecary to pick up a wand and some potions. Our heroes arrived at the town hall at dusk. The 3 town councilors were waiting for them. Introductions were made, as Sienna was meeting Edna and Boris for the first time. Boris and Sienna had an awkward exchange where Boris talked to the rogue in Draconic and asked him about where he was from and about his copper dragon heritage. Sienna was not only a bit shy to talk to someone he had just met about personal matters, but he was also put off by Boris's strange accent. Until meeting Kara, he had never heard anyone besides another kobold speak in Draconic. Humanoids sometimes had issues speaking a language intended for reptiles, but Kara's speech was well enunciated and intelligible. Rodnar had even spoken to him the night before in Draconic and sounded perfectly fine, even matching the sibilant pattern typical of kobolds. Boris's speech, however, was stilted and slurred, and Sienna wanted the uncomfortable conversation to end as quickly as possible. After refusing to acknowledge Boris with anything other than a nod or a shake of the head, the barrister gave up. After informing Edna and Boris of what they had been up to when they left town, Rodnar delivered Sienna his new and improved chain shirt, and then presented the group a variety of silvered weapons. He said if the chain-wielding bandit was indeed a demonic being like the group thought, he was more than willing to loan them whatever weapons they wanted. Reports were that the bandit had single-handedly robbed 2 caravans and made off with the entire wagons full of tools and metal items, and that he had reportedly pulled them away by himself. They did note that he had been uninterested in food items or livestock, and while he had injured the guards and drivers with his chains, he had not as of yet killed anyone he has robbed. He was last seen at the junction in front of the Pollywog Swamp, and that he had headed west with his ill-gotten gains into the Badlands. The town council offered 600 gold pieces for the bandit's head. The contract was written and signed, and the party headed out immediately. Using the information they had just learned, the party decided that Tess would use Silent Image to create the illusion of a wagon being pulled by a pony to act as bait. Since they could be watched the moment they left town, Tess cast the illusion beforehand. They went out the north gate, and it was shut behind them for the night. Kara and Morden lit their bullseye lanterns and led the way, making sure to rotate the beams of light from side to side as they walked. Sienna walked beside the illusionary wagon a fair distance off the road, keeping Kara and Morden just within the periphery of his dark vision. 3 hours later, Kara was suddenly struck in the forehead by a projectile from seemingly out of nowhere, the impact of which nearly knocked her on her rear. Morden called for the wagon to stop and frantically searched the darkness for the unseen assailant with his lantern light. Tess and Sienna hadn't seen the attacker either, but Sienna had definitely heard the crack of the bullet against Kara's helm and rushed forward, relying entirely on his intrinsic ability to see in total darkness. He quickly located the brigand, a small, wiry gnome-like being with a crazy white mustache and dark red cap loading a sling. The sight of the creature stirred up strong emotions of his hatred of gnomes that he had been taught ever since having been hatched. Sienna aimed one of his silver darts at the enemy and let it fly, and in spite of the rogue's fury, the dart completely missed him. The enemy stepped toward the wagon and let loose another sling bullet, which left a streak of bluish-green sparks as it traveled through the air towards its target, striking Kara again in the gut. The aggressor then dropped the sling and pulled a shiny scythe from off his back. Morden had managed to catch the little fiend in his lantern light by then, and Kara cast a ring of blades in response, anticipating another attack. However, the brigand's next target was elsewhere, and he was quickly upon the hexblade instead, dashing right up to him and slashing at his torso with his scythe. Despite his size, the little man was ridiculously strong, and the strike left a gaping cut in Morden's chest. Tess had hurried around from the back of the wagon in time to see Morden take the hit from the scythe. Deciding to forego the illusion so she could cast a spell, she relinquished the silent image, and it dissipated. She then let the red-hatted bandit have it, with a quartet of magic missiles, which simultaneously beat on the little foe's body and nearly knocked him backward. Meanwhile, Kara had gotten her bearings and hurled a bluish-white orb at the enemy. The acid orb caught the bandit completely off guard, and he melted into sludge, which then evaporated. Besides his discarded weapons, all that remained of the creature was a single tiny tooth. Somewhat bewildered, Morden took the tooth. He also picked up the scythe, which he discovered was silvered. They all helped Sienna look for his dart, which did take a while in the dark. However, the search proved fruitful, as they not only found the dart, but also found the bullets that had hit Kara, which turned out to be magical, and found more bullets and some copper pieces that the brigand had dropped. With some effort, Kara used her wand of Cure Light Wounds to heal herself and Morden, albeit she did waste some of the charges trying to get it to work right. The party figured that if the chitin hadn't shown himself during the search for Sienna's dart, then he probably wasn't around. They proceeded for about another hour before reaching the fork in the road, where one path led to Stillwater and the other into the Pollywog Swamp. It was nearly midnight. There, they decided to make camp. They doused their lanterns, and Kara, Morden, and Tess rolled out their bedrolls. Sienna took the first watch and began silently patrolling around the camp while the others slept and dreamed. Morden found himself in a familiar forest. It was bright and sunny. There weren't any animals nearby, but he knew he was there to hunt. He looked down and found a steel bow in his hands. Suddenly, the sky turned yellow, and Morden spun around to see behind him. The great city of Dunhurst was in the sky, a gaping hole left in the ground where it should be. The floating city was buffeted by great jets of water that seemed to come out of nowhere. Morden held out a hand toward his home, but it was helpless to do anything to affect the outcome of its fate. The sun then vanished, and the entire world around him faded to black. Morden turned around back to find himself encircled by darkness. But wait. One thing, something, faded into view. A long, twisting form of pale green scales with great horns, wearing a yellow surcoat. It was the keeper of the reliquary. The demon spoke in his rumbling baritone voice, first stating that Morden's dream was terrible. He then made a great sweeping gesture. The sun reappeared and lit the forest around him. The sky had returned to its normal blue color, and, glancing backward, Morden could see that Dunhurst was once again where it should be. The Tolotrid told Morden that he didn't want him to be afraid, and to listen carefully to what he was about to say. The keeper knew that Morden had taken a job to kill the chitin. He told Morden that ever since they had mentioned to him about where they found the Sunlight Staff, he had been searching for the chitin. He found him, and told Morden that he would find the chitin in the place known as the Goro's Nose. The keeper said that the chitin was lost, and must be found. If he would bring him to the reliquary, he and his companions would be greatly rewarded. The scene around them changed to the Goro's Nose, and the demon seemed delighted by what he saw, stating that he was glad that Morden already knew where it was. Once the demon had finished speaking, Morden began to ask why, but just as the keeper of the reliquary opened his mouth to answer, his image fizzled out and faded. Morden woke up with a start. Sienna had heard Morden gasping in his sleep and rushed over to check. Although Gothos was in a full moon, the sky was overcast, and without any light source, the first thing that Morden saw when he woke up were the faint pinkish sclera of Sienna's eyes, reflecting in what little moonlight there was. After taking a moment to gather his thoughts, Morden told Sienna that he was all right, but Sienna persisted, stating that his gasping didn't sound normal, and that maybe he should look him over. Morden insisted to Sienna that he was only dreaming, and they could talk about it in the morning. Morden went back to sleep. At the end of Sienna's shift, he woke up Kara. Kara took the next watch, but nothing interesting happened beside her trying to continue reading the book in the scant moonlight. During Tessa's watch, she heard the distant howling of wolves, but otherwise nothing happened. Morden had the last shift, and while a canine creature did start sniffing around the camp, Morden had spotted it, lit his torch, and scared it away. Once everyone was up, he related the phantasmal visitation of the keeper of the reliquary in his dream. Morden and the others considered what to do next. They all ended up agreeing to help the keeper and somehow guide the chain devil back to the reliquary. The last part would be easy, they said. It would simply be a matter of locating Sinet or Pilkham in order to find the reliquary again. It was the first part that seemed the more difficult, either convincing the chitin to come with them or capturing the chitin and forcing him to go. Deciding diplomacy to be the best policy, they agreed to let Tess talk to the chitin and try to convince it. They headed out again, this time traveling off the road toward the northwest. Tess resumed her illusion of the wagon filled with coils of chains to once again act as a lure in case the chitin had left his lair. Central North Slowey was covered with hilly badlands, so Tess had to rapidly adjust her illusion to make it so that turning around all the curves and passing over all the bumps looked realistic, but she did so with expert precision. As they journeyed, the sky became cloudier, becoming completely overcast by late morning. When they drew nearer to their destination, the ground yielded yet less vegetation than before. They began to notice long tracks in the mud, like those from a snake, or perhaps the imprints of chains dragging on the ground. Around noon, they spotted the large salt formation that was the Goro's nose on the horizon. It sat upon an island in the middle of a bay. The tracks led up from the dirt across the white sand and ended at the water's edge. The four stood on the beach facing the Goro's nose. Tess dismissed her illusionary wagon, cast tongues, and called out to the chitin. A humanoid head with pallid skin, pale yellow eyes, and a chain wrapped around it like a bandana slowly rose up from a hole near the top of the salt formation to glare at our heroes for a moment, before sinking back down. Tess looked to her companions, and Morden shrugged. Tess continued her attempt at diplomacy, trying to assure the chitin that they meant him no harm and just wanted to talk. When she mentioned escorting him to the Margaran reliquary to see the keeper, the chitin popped his head back out and spoke, agreeing to talk with them and see what they had to say. Two large balls of chains clambered up out of the water, flanking either side of our heroes. Once in this position, they halted and remained motionless. The chitin emerged from a large crevice near the base of the Goro's nose, and crossed the bay over to the beach, using his chains like stilts to prop him up over the water's surface. The chitin spoke in Draconic. Tess could comprehend him with her tongue spell, and Kara and Sienna could also understand the dialogue. All Morden could follow was Tess, so he let the others do the talking. Introductions were made. The chitin's name was Cadenissimo. Kara asked him if he remembered them, and he replied that he did, and wondered where the native with the sunlight staff had gone. Tess said that they no longer had the staff, and Cadenissimo looked somewhat relieved. He then tepidly asked them if they knew who he was. Kara, Tess, and Sienna all answered that they did not, and had never heard of his name before. Cadenissimo seemed deeply disturbed by this, stating that he was lost. Cadenissimo revealed that he worked for Emperor Califax, and asked if his master was well. Tess and Sienna replied that they hadn't heard of him, but the name Califax tickled something in the back of Kara's mind. She recalled from her history class back at Ralnoth University that Califax was the leader of an army of chain devils that had been involved in some sort of upheaval on the Westering Islands roughly 5 centuries ago, and conveyed that to Cadenissimo. The news upset him, and he insisted that Califax had driven back the giants and ruled the Portal Islands. With a bit more back and forth, our heroes learned that the place they had found Cadenissimo was a prison made to contain him. He didn't recognize the name of Venetia, but Kara remembered the proper name that she had seen written on the walls of the dungeon, Athuan, which he did know. He also explained that among his kind, having one's name remembered was an extreme point of pride, and it was the goal of every chitin to make a name for himself. Cadenissimo continued to be incredulous, but he was slowly beginning to realize that an incredible amount of time had passed while he was imprisoned. The chitin had noticed Sienna closely examining one of the mounds of chains, and told him that it was a chain golem. Taking note of Sienna's coppery color, Cadenissimo took a moment to query the rogue about his master, which confused Sienna. He reiterated the question, asking about Feng Bao, Lord of the Copper Dragons, and mistook Sienna for being one of his servants. Dragon lore was important to his people, so Sienna recognized the name, but replied that Feng Bao was ancient history as far as he was concerned, and had been dead for hundreds of years. That information seemed to disappoint Cadenissimo. Kara tried to further drive the message home and make the chitin realize the truth of what they were telling him. He asked if he recognized where he was, and he answered that he was on the island of Zulia. Kara then asked if things looked the same as he remembered, and he acknowledged that everything did look much different than he recalled. Visiting the keeper of the reliquary was brought up again by Tess, and the Chain Devil declared that he was not eager to be enslaved to another Tolotrid. Having heard Tess bring up the subject, Morden requested that Tess make mention of how the keeper contacted him in a dream, but the Chiton knew common and replied to Morden as soon as he had spoken it. This was just as well, as Tess's tongue spell was about to wear off. Chitonissimo mumbled something about the Tolotrid being a dreamwalker, and that those were rare. Speaking aloud to himself, the Chiton said, again, that he was lost, and that he must be found. Then, addressing our heroes, he agreed to go with them and see what the keeper wanted. Our heroes discussed the possibility of just heading back down to Vimarken if Chitonissimo could disguise himself. To demonstrate this skill, the Chiton closed his eyes, and his image transformed before their eyes. However, his appearance was different for each person viewing him. To Tess, he looked like her deceased father, and to Kara, he appeared to be her mother. Sienna saw the All-Watcher from his now-defunct tribe, and Morden saw Blaze. Fernando asked his mistress why the Chain Man suddenly had the head of his dead brother. The images faded, and Chitonissimo asked if that would be sufficient. Morden replied that the illusions were convincing, but if he could only invoke images of people with whom onlookers had strong emotional ties, then they would probably attract too much attention. After that, the chain golems went back the way they came, and each one dragged up a wagon from the water onto the beach. The golems had wrapped their chains around the wagon's tongues. Our heroes climbed aboard one of the wagons and took the lead, while the Chain Devil mounted the other and followed. The golem pulling their wagon responded to their verbal instructions, so once they gave the command, they were off. Morden figured the best way back to the reliquary was to follow the beach westward until they reached the Pelham Cemetery and head south from there. The wagons were dragged over the beach, leaving deep ruts in the sand. The golems never tired or slowed down. Sienna thought about trying to ride a golem, but noticed that their chains were covered with small bumps and spikes that would probably be uncomfortable to sit on, if not downright painful. After a couple of hours, the party spotted a longboat along the shore ahead. Its docking ramp was out, and it looked like some men were unloading goods onto the beach. Morden suspected that they might be pirates, but he let the group get closer to see what their intentions were. When the people in the longboat spotted our heroes, they immediately boarded the boat and pulled in the landing ramp. The longboat raised its sail and pushed off from the shore, and the group could see the crew roll a pair of small catapults to the edge of the deck. It was suggested that they turn inland and avoid confrontation, but Chitonissimo stated that he wasn't afraid of any mere mortals, and they should press on. Tess tactfully replied that while he might survive an attack, the rest of the group wasn't as hardy as he was, and if they all died, then there would be no one to show him where the reliquary was. It was then the crew of the longboat produced another artillery weapon, that of a small ballista, accompanied by a bowl of burning stones. Morden recognized it, shouting out a warning that they had Atlantean fire and that they needed to retreat immediately. Chitonissimo relented, and the chain golems sharply turned to the left, heading southwest away from the coast. They never saw the longboat again, but the sudden trip into the thick forest of central Slowy rapidly put a lot of wear on their wagons. The rough terrain and numerous trees began tearing them apart. At one point, one of the wagon wheels split in two, and Tess had to use a mending spell to quickly put it back together. The party had then decided to head back to the coast, and they continued to follow the sandy beach westward. Later in the afternoon, a thick fog rolled in from the ocean. The fog didn't bother the golems much, as they really couldn't see anyway. The lead golem probed ahead with its chains to get a feel for the terrain and make sure it stayed away from the water and didn't run into any large obstacles. It wasn't long after entering the fog that Fernando told his mistress that he could hear a female voice singing, and that it was beautiful. Soon, they could all hear it. Sienna was considering getting his flute out when a weird feeling overcame him, similar to how Linaro had made him emerge from the forest. This time the magical compulsion urged him to head into the water. So, without a word, he hopped off the rear of the wagon. Morden, having easily resisted the magic charming, caught him in midair by the tail and cradled him. He shouted out a warning to the others. The golems stopped, released their wagons, and headed toward the ocean. Then they all heard another voice join the first. Tess then fell prey to the magic of the sound that beckoned her to the water. Morden started toward her, but then a third voice joined the chorus, and the Hexblade succumbed. He put Sienna down, and both headed toward the ocean. Since he was no longer in control of his own faculties, Morden's dark companion winked out of existence. Kara scanned the horizon, but saw nothing except her companions and the fog. Since Morden was closest to the water, she cast Earthen Grasp, and a sizable hand made of dirt and sand seized Morden's legs and held him in place. The War Mage yelled to Catanissimo that she and him were the only ones left uncharmed, and asked if he knew what was going on. The Chiton strode up beside her and replayed that the awful caterwauling was the siren's song. He lashed out with one of his chains and caught hold of Sienna, and then wrapped another around Tess. The pain of having the chain violently striking Sienna managed to break the magic compulsion affecting him. From under the chains, Sienna began crying out to the Chiton to let him go, but Catanissimo refused, believing him to still be under the siren's charms. A flash of yellowish-green lightning erupted from the fog over the ocean, and blasted away the earthen hand holding Morden back. However, one of the voices stopped singing for a moment to make that happen, and Morden succeeded in pulling free of the siren's mental grasp. He was close enough to the ocean to see a sandbar about 30 feet out from the shore, where Catanissimo's chain golems trudged up out of the water, one at either end. The golems started wildly swinging their chains, and one of them struck an unseen foe. A yellow-skinned woman, adorned with shells and seaweed, suddenly became visible and fell to the ground. Morden's dark companion reappeared beside him, and he and his companion started swimming toward the sandbar. Morden looked back to see Sienna splash into the water after him, having escaped the Chiton's chains without him noticing. Meanwhile, the death of one of the sirens further weakened their mental grip on Tess. Kara put her hands over Tess's ears, and Tess regained control of herself. The girls in unison told Catanissimo to free Tess, and he let the chain drop. With her mind and hands now free, she cast glitter dust in the middle of the sandbar, which revealed another invisible opponent. The siren had been singing, so she caught a mouthful of sparkling golden dust and started uncontrollably coughing and gasping for breath. Sienna took advantage of the situation and paused swimming just long enough to hurl a silver dart, which struck the siren in the neck. Although it too had been caught in Tess's spell, the glittery dust had hardly affected the nearby chain golem, who delivered a killing blow to the siren. Once they reached the islet, Morden stabbed each of the sirens to make sure they were dead. He and Sienna searched from one end of the sandbar to the other, but never found whomever the third voice had belonged to. The sirens had some light weapons and jewelry on them, and a large number of emerald shards. Sienna surmised that the shards had once belonged to a larger gem or gems that had been shattered. After the loot had been collected and everyone was back on shore, they resumed their journey. Night had fallen by the time they reached the cemetery, where they picked up on the road to Pelham heading south. The golems pulled the wagons with a surprisingly smooth gait, and the group took turns catching naps on the way there. They halted at the obsidian formations on the north side of town, and Tess dismounted and entered the village. A guard had been posted at the fort's front gate, but Tess was allowed inside without question. She found Sined's room and roused him. Sined didn't know anything about what the keeper had tasked them with, but he agreed to take them to the secret reliquary, and they returned to the others. Upon meeting Catanissimo, Sined sheepishly asked, could you do the face swap thing again like you did back at Venezia? Catanissimo rolled his eyes and the image of Sined's mother replaced his. Tess asked Sined who it was that he saw, and he replied that he saw his mother. With tears streaming down his cheeks, the favored soul thanked the chiton. Tess then asked why Sined never told them what he had seen, and with a shrug, Sined answered that so much had happened so quickly, and he never really had a chance to share his experience. Since the way to the reliquary was supposed to remain a secret, it took a lot of coaxing from Tess to convince Carinissimo to close his eyes and let Sined lead them. Once they arrived, Sined, Carinissimo, and the keeper of the reliquary had a brief conversation in the flowing melodic language they had heard Sined and the keeper speak to one another before. The keeper of the reliquary offered our heroes his deepest gratitude. One of the display cases on a nearby wall opened, and a silver ring with 4 red gems floated down onto Morden's outstretched palm. The keeper said that it was a ring of 4 wishes, and that he was free to keep the ring and use it however he and his companions desired. Kara was amazed and asked if it actually granted wishes like the spell, to which the keeper replied that it did. They now had to decide what to do next, as the contract that the party had agreed upon with the Vamarkan Town Council explicitly stated that they required the bandit's head. The keeper suggested that no one in Vamarkan would actually know what a chiton looked like, and they could probably bring in the head of any bandit and say that it was him. That idea didn't sit well with Morden. Tess said that they could probably take one of the chiton's chains and simply claim that his body had been vaporized. But once again, the suggestion of deception displeased the hexblade. Carinissimo unwrapped a short chain from around his wrist and offered it to Morden anyway, in case he changed his mind later. The length of the chain was short and thick and had a key attached, and Kara, Morden, Tess, and Sined recognized it as being the key from the Venezian dungeon. Kara said that bringing back the stolen wagons might be enough to satisfy the Vamarkan Town Council, and that seemed to be the best plan they had thus far. The keeper of the reliquary then said that he and Carinissimo had a lot to discuss, and had Sined lead the others out and back to the coastal road leading between Pelham and the cemetery. It was now the middle of the night, and our heroes talked about what to do with the wagons, since the chain golems had stayed behind with Carinissimo. And that is where our session ended. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel to continue following the story of our heroes. Transcripts of our Dungeons & Dragons sessions are available at www.lawful-evil.org/DND. If you enjoyed this and don't already play the game this is based on, you can explore the world of Alter Aeon for yourself by visiting www.alteraeon.com. Remember, the family that plays together stays together. Thanks for listening, and happy mudding, everybody.
Alteraeon.com. That's ALTERAEON.com.